Hi, hello, welcome to the Death for Climate podcast. I am Antoine Kopij, blog editor here at Death for Climate with two wonderful guests, Raouf and Fadhel, both from Tunisia. Raouf is the coordinator of Death for Climate Tunisia, and Fadhel Kaboub is forgive me if I make a mistake in your introduction here, Fadhel. Associate Professor of Economics at Denison University and President of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. That's correct?
Yes.
Right.
Thank you.
And we will talk about the fourth international conference on financing for development, UN conference that will happen on the 30th of June, from the 30th of June to the 3rd of July. Where Death for Climate is going in the conference and in the street to, of course, demand debt cancellation for the climate, to save the climate, essentially, our core mission. So we will start with Raouf and then to present Death for Climate and the general cases of Death for Climate and also the case of Tunisia. Of course, Fadhel, you can intervene at any point you want because you will, of course, probably have opinions and perspectives on Tunisia as well. And then we'll come to your work, your report, a coherent framework for sovereign debt and economic transformation towards Global South Debtors Coalition, which you wrote for the Institute for Economic Justice, a think tank based in South Africa. Right? Sounds good?
All right, wonderful. Super. Thank you.
So, Raouf, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you ended up in Death for Climate?
Thank you. So, I'm Raouf. I'm from Tunisia. I'm now the Africa Regional Coordinator of Death for Climate. And I started I joined Death for Climate in 2022. Just before the COP in Sharm. So before that for climate, I was with the Extinction Rebellion and fighting for climate justice. We found ourselves talking about climate without catching nothing in our hand. We're just talking about climate without really understanding how the system works, how money is, what is climate finance and all. And by time, me, myself, and also my friends and my comrades, we find out that debt is the bones of the system, is how the system works. We found out that by talking about debt, we will be able to solve all the social problems. We will be able to solve the climate justice and the climate change problem. So I joined one of the meeting of Debt for Climate, and I find myself comfortable in the movement, and I find myself talking or in a space. I mean, I say that's what I was thinking about. This is the space that I want to be part of, and this is the fight I want to have. Because also we've been seeing all the debt in the country and how much the country paid. We've been talking about 580 billion in climate-related costs annually, like the developing country have to pay or they're facing up. And when we talk about the climate finance, we found out that they're only given an 89 billion, but we found after that 71% of them are loans, are not grants. So they're not really paying their own debt. They're not taking the responsibility. So we start talking about canceling the debt. We start talking about the debt are illegitimate debt because they're not paying their debt. So this is the main idea. Yes.
Maybe let's start with illegitimate debt and a little bit of history on Tunisia, right? Let's start there. You led us there immediately. So, what is the current debt situation in Tunisia, and where does that debt come from?
So we're not really different from most of the global South country. It it started before colonization, during the colonization, and after that. So before the colonization, like we found out that the old bay trying to have some or to fix some social problems, and they took some loan from France and other countries because we had a lot of uprising due to people refusing to pay tax and all. And then the French colonization came to Tunisia and start using Tunisia to make their own profit. They start using the mean of Tunisia. They start using phosphate. They start using agriculture and all. So Tunisia found itself always related to colonization. Even during the French colonization, we become like just a country to help France to develop herself or so. And after colonization, like we start trying to fix. We had several experience going from the solidarity experience and after so where we start going to the open market. So Tunisia start trying to privatize. And yeah, we're not so different from the global south country where we got really hit hard by the global debt crisis in 1980 because of the raising of the interest rate by the US. And so Tunisia finds itself have to enter to a deal with the IMF and the World Bank. We entered into what it calls the structural adjustment program. It was like an exchange for debt rescheduling and new loans and all. And it was with a really hard and harsh condition. So the IMF and World Bank asked Tunisia to cut public spending and to liberalize trading and investment and all. And this is how Tunisia entered into the circle of debt or the chain of debt that we can't break until today.
Thank
So
you.
yeah.
Thank you, Raouf. Thank you. Let's try to talk about climate change a little bit now. And I know it's a really complex situation, but for you in Tunisia, climate change is a reality that is perceivable in a lot of ways. So can you talk a little bit about how climate change is impacting Tunisia right now?
We're like many other countries now, we're seeing that the farmers are struggling with the new disease. We see the fishermen have to buy more oil to enter into the sea and all. But I think the main problem now we're having in Tunisia is with the energetic transition, with the water crisis. So Tunisia struggling a lot with water. I'm trying to find some numbers because the norm, the rate in the world is 5,000 meter cube per person a day, a year, but in Tunisia it's just 450. So instead of start fixing our situation, instead of that, and because Tunisia have a lot of loans and we are indebted and we need to pay the debt, Tunisia choose to start a kind of agriculture like going into exportation. We decided to put our water into a kind of exportation just to make money. I mean, they don't care about the social field. So now we're seeing Tunisia producing cherry tomato, pineapples, dragon fruit. We're not understanding this. So instead, if we save our water and put it into something important, we're seeing the opposite. And not only that, and now we start seeing the project of the green hydrogen in Tunisia. Because of the energetic transition, now Tunisia, we want a just transition. We want to make our own energetic transition. But now with the GIZ, with the German foundation, with the others.
So
now we have,
GIZ, yeah. let me just for clarification here. GIZ is the name of this German foundation, right? And they are into hydrogen, right?
Energy in general and hydrogen.
Oh, energy in general. Okay. So how does that work? Because I know that water is involved. Can you explain, like, try to explain for people who really don't know anything about this, right? So
now you're seeing them in, like, I would say a lot of ministries in Tunisia, they have offices now and they're putting the agenda and the strategy.
Okay.
And let's talk about the problem in Tunisia. Let's give an example. So in Tunisia, we have a problem of water. And when we're trying to solve the problem of water, we have an old pipe. So we have, in some places, 50% of leak in this pipe of water. If you
That's right.
fix this, we will save a lot of water. We will save more water with less price than putting that into seawater desalination.
Now, that's the project where GIZ,
Right.
that's correct? GIZ, right?
Yes.
The project where GIZ is involved is in desalination, so removing the salt from the seawater, which is like a
Exactly.
very modern, high-tech system, right? And there's a lot of money put into that, right?
Now Tunisia taken a lot of loans to start this project, to
Okay.
build this project in Zarat, Gabes, in Sfax, in Sousse, in other
Okay.
region in Tunisia. And we're spending over than 5 billions, and we'll take a lot of loans to build this. We can spend the half of it to fix the pipe that we have and make more water. So now we are only caring about producing energy for Europe by using our water and also by using our land, because the green hydrogen.
Can you explain that again? Because what is the connection between desalination and
Okay.
energy?
So they want to have a green hydrogen. So the water is HO2.
Yeah,
So they remove the salt from the seawater. And
right.
by the way, they throw it again into the sea. So now we have a high rate
Oh,
of salt into the sea. That's
which is
another
killing
environmental
fish. It's killing
problem.
fish.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Now let me go back here. Desalination is worked with electrolysis, right? Fadhel is correcting me. Fadhel, yeah, I can see this I think it's correct, right? So it's electrolysis, which is separating hydrogen from oxygen, right? And then you end up with clear water, right? And so they want to use this hydrogen as green energy,
Exactly. And
right?
they give the hydrogen to Europe to make
Right.
energy. And after that, we will have to buy the energy from them again also, because we
Ah,
can't make the energy by ourselves.
and where does the clear water go? The water that comes
It is salty water, so it go again into
so what's the
So
point of having, yes,
the
Fadhel.
fresh water to get the HO2
Yeah.
H2O without the salt is needed as an input to produce the hydrogen, the green hydrogen. So
Oh,
there's
that's
two
how
two
it
problems
works.
there. One is the desalination process is very energy intensive to actually do the filtration process. So
Thank you, Fadhel. Right.
you need a lot of land for solar and wind in order for you to call it green. Otherwise, if you use natural gas, it's called blue. If you use fossil fuels, it's called gray hydrogen. So to get the green hydrogen, you need a lot of renewable energy infrastructure. So it's displacing a lot of people from their land. And then you produce the fresh water, you dump the salt back in the ocean to destroy the blue economy. You produce the fresh water, and the ratio that we've seen in most studies, you need 28 liters of fresh water to produce 1 liter of green hydrogen. At least it goes up to 34 liters, according to some studies. And all the green hydrogen that you're producing is not for the Tunisian economy, it's for the European system. So it's purely extractive. It's like greenwashing an old extractivist colonial system. In the meanwhile, Tunisia continues to import fossil fuels and natural gas from other countries and perpetuates its own debt trap. And as Raouf was saying, our water problem is exacerbated by this green hydrogen strategy. When with much less money, you can invest in infrastructure to preserve the water, the little water that we have, to reorient agriculture to the priorities for the Tunisian consumers. We don't need to produce tomatoes and strawberries and watermelon for consumers in Europe. If we had water to spare, we would, but we don't have water to spare to
Of
produce these
course.
water intensive crops, right? So it's just you're being cornered into making these choices that don't benefit the Tunisian economy, that keep you in a debt trap. You're being cornered because you have no choice, or at least you think you have no choice, because you're in debt and your so-called friends are coming to help by getting you
Mhm.
to do whatever they want you to do.
Let's just try to understand a little bit how this debt trap function, right? we have a country, Tunisia, which is indebted to the exterior, which is essentially the IMF, the World Bank, and other countries, right?
Hmm.
To pay this debt, they need money, right? But they need a special kind of money. They need money in foreign currencies, right?
Exactly.
Like euros or dollars,
Yeah.
right? And to obtain this, they need to create this currency. They need to sell something. And in this case, so that's the typical extractive system, right? There's a typical debt
Yeah.
extractivism, debt-fueled extractivism system.
Yeah.
In this case, the natural resource that they will be extracting is water, solar power, right? And what else? Like, I suppose chemistry, like phosphate, right? That's correct, right?
Lots of other things. I mean, the entire economic system in Tunisia and the rest of the global south is based on colonial extractive model and continues to be, especially now as we enter this climate finance phase. It's all greenwashing the old extractivist strategy. So in agriculture, in industry, in the energy system, it's all extractive. If you pay attention to all the investments that are so-called green or decarbonization, you pay attention, you realize it's reproducing the same colonial hierarchy that was imposed on the African continent. And it can be summarized in three basic points so that you can use this as a lens to analyze any project that is put on the table as supposedly climate finance or development. And then you figure out that the entire thing is part of an economic entrapment and greenwashing. So the colonial model that was imposed on Tunisia and the rest of the global south does three things. Number one, it makes you the place for cheap raw materials for the industrialized world. We still do that, whether it's green hydrogen or cherry tomatoes or minerals. It's still the same model. Number two, it makes you the former colony or now the developing countries that we're talking about today, makes you the consumer of industrial output and technologies from the global north. And that is still the case. You import the desalination technology, the green hydrogen technology, not for your own use, but for extractive purposes, right? And all the technologies by design imported. A little footnote, historical footnote here. A lot of the colonies in the early days of colonization were actually on track to develop almost following the same pathway of industrialization of the global north. In Tunisia, in particular, textile was actually taking off with mechanization and automation using the new technology that was made available at the time as
We're
soon as the
talking
French.
just for clarification, what
Yeah,
period are we talking about here?
we're talking about the late 1800s when Tunisia was
Okay,
colonized. Yeah, early 1900s,
early
late
industrialization period, of
early
course.
industrialization. As the Tunisian textile industry was taking off, France started banning the import of equipment for textile development. So it kept textile lagging behind because you're not supposed to compete with
Right.
European textile. You're supposed to, use the thread and needle by hand to do traditional
Hmm.
textile and not to catch up. And you can see this in all industries. So
It
this
reminds me
idea
of
that
China and the ban on Chinese porcelain in the UK in the same
yeah, yeah,
years, right?
yeah, exactly, exactly. So that is the second economic role that was imposed, is to be the consumer of technologies from the north, not the producers of technologies. And third and most important role is the fact that the only kind of manufacturing base that you're allowed to have is the kind that produces low value added content. So any kind of obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing that is no longer needed in the industrialized world is outsourced to you to assemble with low cost labor under the label of cooperation and development and we're friends and all kinds of nice labels put on it. But effectively what it does is it locks you permanently at the bottom of the hierarchy. And we still play
Absolutely.
that role to this day. So any proposal, whether it's on debt or climate or development or cooperation, that doesn't undo these three colonial roles is part of an economic entrapment that is designed to reproduce the exact same hierarchy. And we know this because every time we push for real proposals that will undo some of these roles, that's where you see the red lines. That's where you see, negotiators from the global north saying, no, 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 this is not what we're here for. This is not part of the meeting. We're here to talk about carbon credits. We're here to talk about climate finance. It's like, yeah, but this is transformative climate finance we're talking about. Because from an African perspective, from a global south perspective, climate finance is development finance. There's no separation between the two. But as soon as we go into that territory, that's where the red lines appear, and that's where the discussion ends, because it disrupts the hierarchy.
Thank you, Fadhel. That's a very cool summary, very helpful summary. Raouf, I want to ask you here a little bit about debt swaps, right? What they are? Who's proposing them at FFD4 at the next UN conference in Seville, which will happen this month, right? Already, end of this month. Walk us through a little bit about debt swaps, sorry, debt for climate swaps. It's the same name as our organization, and we don't like them. It's really annoying, right? But they're called debt for climate swaps, also debt for nature swaps. So what are those?
Well, for us, we're going to the FFD also, and especially to refuse this agenda of the debt swap. We're mobilizing against the debt swap. And what we're seeing that the Global North, the World Bank, the IMF, the one who are supporting the debt swap, it works for them. It's for their benefits. And for us also, we've started a debt audit, and we're calling for debt audit to show how the debt are illegitimate and illegal to refuse the debt swap. You can't swap an illegitimate debt. You have to cancel it.
Okay, what is a debt swap a little bit first? Like, what is the concept of a debt swap, a debt for climate swap? How does it function?
I don't have exactly the
That's okay.
term, but what I understand so far, from what I'm seeing from other countries, is trying to sell their debt by project, like to give the debt to another country. They will like buy it for you and start doing project, and you will be indebted to that country, not to the other one. And you have all your debt for this country. And for us, like it doesn't make sense to be indebted to this or to that, or to have a project not by your own money. And that's why we're calling for unconditional debt cancellation. I'll give an example in Senegal, because recently we started a citizen audit after the government of Senegal found a $7 billion hidden debt. And they said it's the responsibility of the IMF and the old president in Senegal. And the government of Senegal now are refusing to pay it. And I think they will stop working with the IMF also. So for us, we started the campaign, and we wanted to start a citizen audit with some of the parliaments, with the university, with activities, organizations and all, and wanted to show where the debt or where the loan were spent. Did people benefit from these loans or no? To show that they are a legitimate debt. And we know it's not a legitimate debt. We know it's illegal. And by having the debt audit, we will show that clearly. And then we will be able to talk about refusing the debt swap. And then we will be able to talk about the debt cancellation. So by going to the FFD, we will try to mobilize to push for this and to start a debt audit in some countries. We hope we can make it, because in some countries it's not easy, maybe because of the lack of transparency, maybe it depends on the government and how they want to work and all. But at least we're trying to reach out to the progressive government to talk to them, to push them into the debt audit and to refuse the agenda of the debt swap, because we see it as another trap also.
So we have examples of debt audits that worked, right? There is the case of Ecuador, and there is also the case of Brazil, right, for debt audits, right? Debt audits, Fadhel, do you know a bit about them?
Yeah, and it has to be triggered by the government itself. right? So if you have a political establishment that is actually willing to move in that direction, then you can get a debt audit. Ecuador was a very good example, recent example of this, because at the time the government wanted to audit the debt to see what is legitimate, what is not legitimate. And that usually scares bondholders because they know that quite a bit of the debt is illegitimate. If they had nothing to worry about, if they knew that the debt was legitimate, then an audit should enhance transparency and confidence in the economy. But when you know that you're dealing with fraud potentially and abuse, and that you're part of it, then that's what scares you, right? So that should be a telling red flag when markets react with this kind of reaction. You know that there's a reason why the government wanted the audit in the first place.
Right.
And because typically the movements that are pushing for debt audit are going after a very important and powerful legal principle. So it's not just politically motivated. In international law, there is a very clear concept, principle called the odious debt doctrine, which is more than 100 years old and has been used several times to cancel illegitimate debt legally, right? It's a legal concept. But in order to, apply this legal principle to successfully cancel illegitimate debt, you have to establish three basic things. Number one, you have to show that the money was borrowed without the consent of the people, meaning in a non-democratic way, right? You have a dictatorship, for example, that just borrowed a lot of money and there is no due process, there's no transparency, the public didn't know about it. And that is, that's the first step. It's not, sufficient. That's only point number one. Point number two, you have to establish and demonstrate that the money was not used to benefit the people, as in the society, the country at large. That benefited maybe a small minority or a military or the elite, right? And that is a second very important component. But the third one is the most important one. And this is where the investors really get involved because it's on them. The third one is you have to establish that the lenders knew about point one and point two, right? And when you can establish 3 points, these 3 points under international law, you can cancel the debt legitimately, right? This is a legal doctrine that's been used in the past. So you start a debt audit, you're essentially going to discover these 3 things. What was the money borrowed for? Did the people know about it? Did the people benefit from it? And did the lenders know all of this? And when you start a serious debt audit, you will find quite a bit of debt, especially debt that was, incurred under dictatorship or, non-democratic governments or corrupt governments with lots of foreign investment and interference and favors to get deals. You'll get a lot of potential debt cancellation. And that's why a debt audit scares these bondholders, because they know how the debt was piled up, because they know that there's been fraud and abuse.
Just to take the point of view of the devil's advocate a little bit, or just pretend that I haven't been researching or reading about this for a long time. I would like you to, Fadhel, I would like you to try to explain to us a little bit how debt works in dictatorships. So where is the money invested in, and why is it called illegitimate in the case of dictatorship as opposed to an elected, democratic, transparent government? Or at least transparent.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you an example where the odious debt doctrine was actually applied successfully to cancel debt of dictatorship that accumulated a lot of debt. And you'll realize how political or geopolitical this can be. So the Iraqi debt cancellation that James Baker orchestrated after the Iraq invasion. This is after they got rid of the Saddam regime. James Baker, if people remember, traveled all over the world, mostly in Eastern Europe, to talk to lenders who lent money and weapons to buy weapons, Eastern European weapons, to the Saddam regime prior to that, and looked at them straight in the face and said, this money was borrowed by a dictatorship without the consent of the people. The money was used not to benefit the people, it was to build up military capabilities to defend the regime. And you, the lenders, knew about it. So these are the three principles of international law that say this is illegitimate debt. It's going to be canceled, and it was canceled on the spot. So that was the US putting its weight on the table to essentially push through debt cancellation, which benefited the US agenda, of course, at the time. But it demonstrated that this is what international law is, right? This is how you cancel. So why did James Baker not do this to a whole bunch of other countries? That's a separate question, right? But this is where the effort from the grassroots comes in, that if we push for debt audits and we get governments to comply with debt audits, then you can make the legal case and you can lead a national and international campaign for debt cancellation, right? So I'm all for, pushing for this grassroots democratic process. But there's more, right? And this is where we should be very clear about this. And I think we say it in the report that you referred to earlier. And I usually say it in all my work. That is, we can cancel all the debt, not just the illegitimate debt, the entire debt of the global south today. But I guarantee you in 10 years, we'll have another debt crisis. Why? Because the engines that produce external debt in the global south are just still operating under the surface. So if we're going to go after the root causes of external debt, yes, cancel illegitimate debt, but also go after the engines that produce external debt. And those are three basic engines in the global south. Number one, it's food imports. Africa, in particular today, imports 85% of its food. And as you know, no country, no continent can function without food, right? And this is not by accident. Africa, less than 100 years ago, used to be the breadbasket for colonial powers. So it's the international trade system that was transformed as soon as Africa started to gain independence, that forced the African agricultural system into a debt trap and food insecurity by providing heavy agricultural subsidies in the global north, in Europe and the US, Canada, Australia, and the former Soviet Union, which is why Russia and the Ukraine dominate in the grain production, to produce the core crops of wheat and corn and rice and soybean and so on. That forced the farmers of the South, who couldn't compete with the cheaper crops from the North, to specialize in producing cherry tomatoes and bananas and coffee and tea and tobacco. All of those colonial cash crops, right, became the dominant source of agricultural revenues. And those are items that are not edible, right? They're not for your food security. Your food security is rice and wheat and barley and all of that. So you became food insecure by design. So you have to export as much as you can of these cash crops to multinational corporations who control global prices of coffee, tea, and tobacco and all of that. So you never get a fair deal. And you import from monopoly multinationals who control the price of wheat, the price of rice, and everything else. So you're always locked in a hunger situation, in a debt trap. That's one component of the debt engine. The second component is the energy system, and no country can function without energy, right? It's the lifeblood of the system. And when I say energy deficits in the global south, in Africa in particular, I'm not talking about countries that never had fossil fuels and all of that. Of course, those countries struggle, but I'm talking about the biggest oil exporters on the continent. Take Nigeria, number one exporter. Take Angola, number two exporters. And the old energy system, the fossil fuel system that we want to replace, They were always denied access to the technology to look for oil, technology to drill for oil, technology to refine oil. Nigeria, up until just a few months ago, before they built the Dangote refinery, Nigeria imported 100% of its gasoline from international markets. 100%. This is the biggest oil producer on the continent. Gasoline that is actually illegal to sell in Europe, by the way, because
Sorry,
of
what? Excuse me?
Gasoline that is illegal to sell in Europe.
So they
because of
import, Nigeria is importing gasoline of bad quality, is that it? Because
yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Well documented. I'm
all
happy
right,
to
so
share the resources.
I trust
Yeah.
you. What I mean is, what kind of problems do you have if you use this gasoline?
Oh, it's just the level of the particles that will be released in the air
So
are
extra
just bad
polluting,
for,
extra polluting.
extra polluting. As if the pollution, whether it's happening
Right.
in Lagos or in Amsterdam, makes a difference to the planet, right? But it gives you a sense of how the system is designed. Angola, the second largest, to this day imports 80% of its fuel, right? And the list goes on. So that is the old energy system. And now let's pay attention to the new energy system. Africa has the biggest potential for renewables on the planet, has all the critical minerals to manufacture and deploy the renewables infrastructure. And yet, Africa receives less than 2% of financing that goes towards renewables. And Africa, again, is being denied access to the manufacturing technology to manufacture and deploy and unleash this potential for renewables, which should be a win-win for everybody. But that is the reality. So that's engine number one. Number two of debt. You have food, you have energy, and then the third one is the manufacturing base that we were allowed to have in the global south, which is where you have to import the machines, you have to import the fuel to power the factories, you have to import the intermediate components to assemble with low-cost labor as you race to the bottom, and even import the packaging. So you end up with a manufacturing base that produces low value added content, and what you import is high value added content. So you can double, triple, quadruple your exports with partnerships and free trade agreements and all of that. You're always locked at the bottom of the hierarchy. So these three structural deficits, now we tie them together and we see how they reproduce the debt trap. They produce a structural trade deficit. And as all of you know, that a trade deficit weakens my currency relative to the dollar, relative to the euro. And now if I have a weaker currency, let's say the Tunisian dinar, which has been falling relative to the dollar, relative to the euro over the last couple of decades and more, like most African currencies. The next morning, if I want to import wheat, if I want to import medicine, if I want to import fuel, right? Basic necessities.
Yeah.
I import it with a weaker currency, which means I import it at a higher price. So I literally import inflation in the most sensitive areas of my economy, which means the next morning I might have social uprisings because people can't afford food.
Yes,
This is where we close it up with the link to debt. So now the government has to protect the most vulnerable. How do we do it? We do two things. One, we try to subsidize food and fuel and medicine as much as possible. And two, we ask the central bank to do its best to stabilize the exchange rate. How do they stabilize the exchange rate? They borrow more dollars, which feeds the debt trap. And now dollars accumulate into unsustainable debt with the lenders dictating what you do with those dollars. The lenders want to be paid back. So they want you to spend money on things that will generate dollar revenue. So instead of producing wheat or corn or rice for your people, they say, no, 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 no. We want you to produce more cherry tomatoes, more strawberries, more dragon fruit, more coffee, more tea, more tobacco to export. So it enhances your food insecurity and your dependence on external markets. And that's what we see for decades. That is the economic entrapment model that we're seeing. And that eats up your fiscal policy space. So now you have no resources to dedicate to health or education or climate action or just investing in fixing water pipes so you can preserve some of the water that you have.
Thank you, Fadhel, for this very clear explanation. I think I will come to Raouf about Senegal, right? Because Raouf, you have a point to make about Senegal. But Fadhel, I would like to try to I want to try to summarize the monetary point that you made about the dollar, just to see if I get it right. right? Because it's
Yes.
complicated and it's a thing that a lot of people at Debt for Climate struggle with, and I've been struggling with for years, honestly, to understand how this works. So let's say this is the story of the 80s crisis, right?
Hmm.
And so we have a situation where the global south borrowed a lot of money to invest in infrastructure in Africa and South America,
Hmm.
right? And they have a lot of debt, but the economy is okay, or at least it seems okay. And that money is coming from petrodollars. So like there's a lot of money flowing in from investors who want some comfortable rent from the global south, and the global south is taking this money to invest in their own infrastructures. And then all of that, so something important, all of that is made in dollars, right? All of that
Yeah.
is borrowed in dollars, exchanged in dollars. But then suddenly there is a price shock. Actually, there is a revolution in Iran, right? And other things and also speculation on the market. And oil goes up. The price of oil goes up. And the reaction from the Federal Reserve is to raise the interest rate, right?
Hmm.
And for some reason, which for years I've been struggling with, for some reason, that raise in interest rate has decades of impact, of terrible, horrible impact on the economy of the global south.
Hmm.
But the global north ends up okay after this. So why is the dollar so important? Is it because like essentially the global south doesn't have their own currency and they don't have any control on their own monetary policy? And if they had that control, it would be better. But it's also a question of trade, right? Of trade imbalance.
Right. So it's a couple of things because
Right.
and this is really a lot of the work that we're doing now is to spread this understanding that the concept of sovereignty, national sovereignty, is not just about having your territory and your flag and your football team and national anthem. Of course, you have that, but there's a concept of economic and monetary sovereignty, which was never delivered after independence. I mean, some African countries, Senegal included, we're talking about Senegal today, that are still using a colonial currency, right? Literally, the French CFA franc
The
is the
franc
same
CFA,
colonial
n'est-ce pas?
currency. France CFA,
Of course.
exactly. But it's not just the CFA zone that still uses a colonial economic system. The entire global South never finished the unfinished business of structural economic decolonization. So what we've experienced in the late 70s and early 80s with the debt crisis that eventually exploded in the 80s is simply the continuation of colonial extraction in a bunch of countries that have no economic and monetary sovereignty. Because you can look at, countries like Japan today, like the US, with massive national debt, right? But the entire debt stock of the United States is denominated in US dollars. Japan has the highest debt to GDP ratio in the world. I think last time I checked, it's 270% or something, debt to GDP ratio. But the entire debt stock is in Japanese yen, right? And the Japanese economy has the structural pillars of its economy are intact, meaning, they have strong, food system, energy system, manufacturing system. The three structural weaknesses that we have in the global South: a deficient food system, energy system, and manufacturing system. So these are concepts that cannot be ignored, right? And if you ignore them, then you get into these crises. And that's why the structural decolonization, the structural transformation that we must fight for, whether we're talking about debt or climate or development or any issue that we're negotiating in multilateral spaces, cannot ignore the structural colonial traps that persist. So any movement on debt cancellation needs to be supplemented with structural transformation that will address the root causes of the engines of debt and economic entrapment. That's strategic investments in food sovereignty and agroecology, which coincidentally happens to be climate policy also, not just debt policy. Strategic investments in renewable energy infrastructure, which solves the debt problem, but it's also coincidentally a solution to the climate challenges that we have. And strategic investments in high value added manufacturing, not reproducing the global north manufacturing system with pollution and consumerism and planned obsolescence, but living within a planetary boundaries, real industrialization that allows the global south to escape the bottom of the value chain, the bottom of the hierarchy, that prioritizes manufacturing the building blocks of development, starting with renewable energy infrastructure, clean cooking infrastructure, clean transportation infrastructure. All of this happens to be not just a solution to debt, but coincidentally, it's a solution to the climate challenges. So what we're pushing for in the COP space or in the FFD space, negotiating on debt or any other space, are these structural transformation strategies that complete the unfinished business of decolonization of the 1950s and 60s. And that's why we see the red lines in the global north, because that structural decolonization disrupts the existing hierarchy. And that is something that makes the global north very uncomfortable about what comes out of this disruption, because they anticipate a hierarchy to be replaced by another hierarchy, which is sad that there is a crisis of imagination, that the only kind of global system that we have must have somebody at the top and somebody at the bottom, instead of a truly multipolar system of peace, justice, and sustainable prosperity. And that is kind of the agenda that many of us are trying to push. That, don't be afraid of the disruption, because it's a disruption to produce justice, right? So you shouldn't be afraid of justice, right? You should be afraid of injustice, right? You shouldn't resist justice. You should resist injustice.
Yeah, that's yeah. A lot of people might hear you. It's very interesting. You should not be afraid of justice, and you see so many powerful people being afraid of justice right now. Now, Raouf, you had a point to make about you had a point to make about Senegal.
Can you repeat? I didn't get.
No, I was you wanted to talk about Senegal. You had a case about Senegal.
Yeah, I've talked about it, but I'm hoping that the same happening in Senegal will happen in another country, because now we're seeing a lot of change happening in this area of Africa, in the west side of Africa. So now we're seeing a lot happening in Burkina Faso. We're seeing the change happening in Mali, in Niger, in Senegal.
What kind of
So
change?
change of government, change of their speech. Now all of them, they're saying we don't want to work with France again. We want to cut this relation with France and with the World Bank and the IMF. We want to build ourselves. We want to build our own sovereignty and our own economy. And we're trying to follow. We're trying to understand, because somehow I would say also we're a little afraid if it is a change from an imperialist power to another imperialist power, because we want our own sovereignty. And if you're not working with France or with the World Bank and IMF anymore, we prefer if you start building yourself. So we're trying to follow to understand how things is happening, but so far we're happy with the change, and we're trying to push by this campaign to do the same in the countries. So now we're seeing some progressive parliament in the CDAO, in Senegal, in Burkina Faso.
What is the
There,
CDAO?
CDAO, it is, well, I would say it's a parliament of the west coast of Africa. Um, yeah, exactly. I don't have the
That's all
brief
right.
of
We
it,
get it.
but
Now, West
yeah,
African governments. Okay.
so far we have some people inside this parliament we're talking to, and they're pushing for that cancellation, and they were pushing for the debt audit. And we're seeing their speech talking about sovereignty, talking about how we can build our economy, and talking about a just transition in all the field. So we would like to do the same in all the global south. So we would like to learn from this, and we hope that this can show to the other country the possibility to build our own sovereignty and all. So we will start in Senegal. We hope the other organization will join our campaign also. We hope we can make a good citizen audit and we can show the illegitimate debt and they're illegal. Also, what Fadhel says and mentioned about the coutume we have, the international law about the debt cancellation is very important and it will give us a good, I would say, weapon to use against the indebtor because I'm seeing a possibility because
You mean
we've seen
creditors? Yes.
exactly, yeah, the creditors. We've seen a big possibility to cancel the debt because we know exactly that most of the government are dictator. People that don't know about the debt, there is no election, there is no democratic process. So let's see what we can do.
A lot of challenges in countries that are run by dictatorships, right?
I'm remembering the situation in Tunisia because I wasn't old enough, but I still remember how was it before and after the uprising or the revolution.
The revolution, what was the year of the revolution? Can you remind us?
It's 17 December, 14 January 2011.
2011.
Exactly. So it is a big change. You can see even the attitude of people how it changed. You can see how important to have democracy, to have the right of speech and all. Now people in Tunisia, they feel free. They feel it's their own country. They start questioning you. Why are you doing this? Even if we're afraid now of the change happening in Tunisia with the new president, but we still know that the Tunisian will never accept going back. So to taste the democracy or to taste how important it is, you have people that understand this importance and they will never go back again. So we're even seeing that in the dictator country, people that don't even have, I would say, a self-respect. They don't feel it's their country. They don't feel they have the right to talk in their country or to choose or to decide. So I would say it is a crime even for the person, even for the people. So, and it's directly related with debt. It's directly related with imperialism because we know that this imperialist government, they prefer to have dictator system in this country to avoid people talking about the social justice. And we're seeing all the militarization around the extractivist places and the mine zone. We're seeing in Congo what is happening with the gold. We're seeing in Mali and Niger. We're seeing like everywhere. We're seeing in Iraq, Syria, and all with gas and petrol. So everywhere you find military, you find war, there is money there. If you don't accept to get loans from them, they will put some military groups there and start a war in your place, maybe. So, yeah.
All right. Very grim picture with so many conflicts in the world, right? But that opens up to what we have on the agenda right now, which is FFD4, which is the UN conference. Fadhel, why are there reasons to hope from this conference? What is special about this place, the UN, compared to other international institutions?
Well, what gives hope about the UN in general and the FFD process in general is that it's one country, one vote, right? This is not the UN Security Council. This is not the World Bank. This is not the IMF. No veto power. And that gives an opportunity for the global majority, which is the global South. Let's not forget that the global majority, the global South, is more than 80% of the global population. That gives the global South, the global majority, the opportunity, if coordinated and speaking with one voice and pushing for one common agenda, to really get some major agenda items on the table and start pushing for change, for transformation. In addition to that, what gives us hope is that this conference, FFD4, happens once every 10 years. So it's not once in a lifetime. It's once in a 10-year opportunity to push for something meaningful. And one of the major changes that is unfolding as we speak is the decolonization of the international taxation system. So when you think of the global economic architecture, you can think of four components of the economic architecture: international taxation, the rules of international trade and investment, which is the WTO, and the international financial architecture, that's the World Bank and the IMF. But the international taxation pillar, for the longest time, has been in the hands of the OECD countries, essentially deciding the rules of.
That's a lot of acronyms. Excuse me, Fadhel. A lot of
Yes,
acronyms. So the OECD is the
the organization
organization.
of
Yeah.
economic
Oh,
cooperation and development or something like that. Yeah, it's based in Paris, and it's a
that's
global
right.
north club of nations with a few global south that have been invited in recent years to join. But it's really dominated by the global north. And it has been essentially dominating how international taxation is done. In
That's right.
FFD3, 10 years ago, which was in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, the Africa Group, which is a major voting bloc,
That's right.
pushed with one voice and worked closely with Latin American countries led by Colombia and others to get the global majority, the global South, to vote to finally decolonize. This is my words, not their words, but essentially to move the rules of international taxation from the hands of the OECD countries into a UN tax convention framework, which is being designed as we speak. And that vote happened at the UN about almost 2 years ago now, a year and a half ago. And now we're in the process of actually establishing the rules of international taxation that is going to be a major change, right? Governed democratically with one country, one vote, no veto power for France or the US or Germany or any other country for that matter. And that process of moving the international taxation from OECD to the UN has been viciously resisted. You can go back to the records and the speeches by the US, by the UK, by the global north, and see how viciously the delegates, the ambassadors of the global north, have resisted this democratization process, decolonization process. So that gives us hope that when the global south is organized with one goal, with one agenda, we can actually move the needle in the right direction. So like we did in the last 10 years leading up to the transformation of international taxation now, there's hope that if we go to Spain in a couple of weeks with a common transformative agenda on debt, right? On debt and development that not only pushes for debt cancellation and debt relief and reducing the cost of capital, kind of these kind of helpful but relatively smaller and not threatening to the hierarchy kind of options, but really go to the engines that produce debt, that produce underdevelopment, that produce inequality, that produce socioeconomic exclusion. If we can go to those engines, then we can have, the global south pushing with one voice, with one agenda over the next few years, hopefully leading to a UN tax convention framework on debt in which we can address the root causes of structural transformation to do essentially the unfinished business of structural decolonization to finally end the process of economic entrapment, because that's what it is. It's a process of economic entrapment that weakens the global south. So that's the hope, and that's why this conference is so important.
Raouf, please.
I just want to ask because after hearing this information, it's very important for us to understand how we can mobilize, because we know that we have the majority and all. But at the same time, I may ask for advice because I heard some groups and activists say that the decision can be made even before the FFD, and that they prefer to mobilize before the FFD because they don't believe maybe on negotiation and all. And we start hearing also some outcomes or some information before the FFD about the position of some countries and all. So I'm not sure if I know that we should start mobilizing from now, but I'm not sure about how is it true that the decision can be made even before the FFD.
Yeah, so the FFD4 process actually started last July in Addis. So there were four preparatory meetings that are leading up to Spain. So those four meetings happened, and in those four meetings, you started to see the, policy position of different countries, of different voting blocs. And that's where you see a lot of the lobbying and the divide and conquer strategies of the global north trying to distract and make sure that the global majority is divided, right? Because they know when the global majority is united, it's unstoppable. So as long as they're divided, you can manage to get a no outcome at the end, right? So that's been the fight over the last 12 months or so, is to keep the global South united, pushing with one coherent agenda. It's not true that it's all a done deal yet. There's still room for unity, for pushing for a common agenda. So the major blocks, obviously the G77 is an important bloc. The Africa Group is an important bloc. But there are also other regional blocs in Latin America, the small island states, and so on. And it's about recognizing that we all have the same structural economic entrapment problems. We have different issues, we have different resources, different trade agreements, but all of these countries are also being approached by different countries in the global north, offering them special deals, special treatment, special partnership to stay away from their bloc, their what should be their alliance. And so that's part of the challenge is for us, the think tankers, the activists, the organizers, to play that support role of keeping the global South organized and united, and aware of the divide and conquer and the external pressure that they face. And you have to recognize that each country in the global South has a dashboard of vulnerabilities, right? Debt, internal security issues, external regional security issues, energy problems, food security problems, all kinds of things, right? And that dashboard of vulnerability represents points. Countries in the global north can push those buttons and really cause some serious pain, right? And that is what happens behind the scenes now. So it's not like a country from the global north will say, "Oh, we don't want you to join the Africa Group on their position. Otherwise, we're going to push this button." It's like you already know what your vulnerability is, and you know that you're dependent on country XYZ, on aid, on trade, on health, on all kinds of issues. So you already know your dashboard of pressure points. So they don't even need to speak to you, right? To know that if you do something that will, challenge us and make us look bad or uncomfortable, then you will be on the not friendly list, right? At least, right? So that is kind of the insidious power that seeps through the system every time there's an opportunity for real structural transformation. So the role of civil society here is to really keep the negotiators from the global South united, and fearless, and to show them that there's support. So the physical presence on the ground is actually important. When those negotiators are surrounded by people who are on their side, it's almost like cheering for a football team, right? As you can cheer from your living room where they can't hear you, or you can cheer in the stadium where the action is actually happening. And this is why the physical presence can really make a difference, at least to some extent. And recognizing that those negotiators, they're not heads of states, right? They're either ambassadors or given a title of an ambassador for the sake of the negotiation. So they have limited political capital at the end of the day. And finally, the thing that we should all recognize that there are phone calls that are made from capital to capital in the last few minutes of the meeting, and that's where the real pressure comes in. That's where the dashboard of vulnerability really shows its ugly face. So you have to recognize that sometimes countries are actually cornered into, voting a certain way or being quiet or not pushing as hard as we want them to push. So that's the reality of not just FFD, any multilateral negotiation space. Because at the end of the day, I said this after COP. COP in Baku was about climate finance, supposedly. I said this was not about climate finance. It was not even about climate. It was about an economic hierarchy that is not meant to be disrupted. Similarly, I fear that this FFD is not really about financing, development, or debt. At the end of the day, it's about a hierarchy that's not meant to be disrupted, right? Yes, the theme is debt and development and finance, and maybe some climate finance embedded in there. As soon as you get to the transformative policies that will actually deliver on the mandate of this conference, that's where you see the red lines. That's where you realize this is not about FFD. This is about a geopolitical hierarchy, an economic hierarchy that doesn't want to be disrupted.
Raouf, you want to react to that? No. Okay, so I think it's a good time to move to your report, right? And explore the ideas that you develop in there. And before that, I suppose it's good to point at a few facts about the geopolitical situation of the world, right? We have a former superpower or fading superpower in the chief of the United States that is basically walking out of the stage, right? Almost like basically disappearing, or they cut funding for aid for like the rest of the world. They cut funding from the UN. They send threatening emails to UN personnel, UN staff, in case they want to, in case they would get involved in helping organization that promotes what they call the woke agenda, right? So we have this type of so yeah, it's a disaster, and it's hard to take them seriously. But of course, they still maintain a lot of economic power, and the tariffs, right? The Trump tariffs are tariffs. Sorry, pronunciation. Tariffs. Thank you. Tariffs. They mean isolationism, right? In a kind of well, we can debate if it is rational or not. It seems not, but maybe I don't understand. In any case, it means that the United States has the ambition of being self-reliable and isolate from the rest of the world, right? Europe is in a lot of parts heading the same way, right? You have a proposition for the next player that appears on that stage. It's been appearing since 30 years, 40 years, right? So you call this proposition the bargain of the century. Can you explain?
Yes. So first, a shout out to my co-author, Andres Chiriboga from Ecuador, who has been with me over the last few years working on questions related to sovereign debt and debtors coordination. So we co-authored this piece for the for Economic Justice in South Africa. It's available on their website. And it started as a sort of a critique of the G20 common framework on debt, which, as you know, was introduced a few years ago, supposedly to deal with the urgent debt crisis that was exploding during the COVID crisis. And now, several years later, COVID is behind us, and the COVID debt crisis has not been resolved by the G20. Yet another reason to look into the FFD process. And we might be entering another debt cycle, and the common framework is still talking about the common framework, which is a separate issue. But the closing of that paper leads to something that I've been working on in the last couple of years, which is what I call the bargain of the century. Because at the end of the day, the kind of transformation that we're hoping for, right, the structural transformation that will address the root causes of economic entrapment, require a geopolitical leverage, right? Because we can go to all of these multilateral spaces, to COP, to FFD, to other places, and we can make the legal case for debt cancellation. We can make the moral, the ethical case, the economic case. At the end of the day, you have no power to compel the other side to actually comply, to pay its climate debt, to cancel the illegitimate debt, or to do anything, or to share life-saving technologies, whether it's for COVID vaccines or life-saving technologies to allow you to manufacture clean cooking infrastructure or clean transportation infrastructure. All of that real transformation, the tools of real transformation are withheld from you intentionally. So I started working on how do we compel the other side to actually start sharing life-saving technologies? How do we compel the other side to give up this obsession with the existing geopolitical and economic hierarchy? And how do we truly create a multipolar world, right, that is not hierarchical, a multipolar world of peace, justice, and sustainable prosperity under a new international economic order? In other words, I wanted to go back 50 years ago to the discussions that the new international economic order was having 70 years ago, to the Bandung Conference on decolonization, on finishing the unfinished business, right? And sort of update it in today's context and say, how do we get there? How do we finish this unfinished business? And the idea is the following, and it starts with some assumptions. I grant you that, and this is where the work of civil society and the grassroots comes in. But at the end of the day, geopolitical bargains are played by heads of states, not by activists, not by diplomats, not by think tanks. So there's a role for us to do in terms of pushing from below, but eventually we have to have heads of states who have the courage to think and act differently. And as you know, history doesn't remember those who never tried, right? Or those who stood in the way of transformation. History remembers those who tried. History remembers those who tried and failed. History remembers those who tried and died trying. And that is the starting point in terms of who will be the heads of states who will have the courage to lead or co-lead this bargain of the century. And the idea is the following. Imagine for a moment that we have a block of global south countries, let's say 15 or 20 countries, from Africa, Latin America, and Asia, ideally, without China, right? We're not including China. We're not including this block has the advantage of the economies of scale needed for real industrialization. No country can industrialize alone unless you're the size of China or the size of India, right? Because to industrialize, you need economies of scale, which means you have to have large, market size internally. Otherwise, you rely on exports. And if you try to industrialize alone, which is what most of us do.
Can I
Yes.
just slow down a little bit here? So what you
Yes.
mean there is that you need to have a market to sell your stuff that you produce,
Yes.
right?
A large
Just
market, not just
a
a small
large
market.
market. That's what you mean by economy of scale, right?
Yes.
Okay,
Because
go on.
economies of
Sorry.
scale means the larger the volume you produce, the lower the cost per unit, the better the quality, the better the efficiency. All the benefits of industrialization can only be achieved when you have large volumes of production, right?
Got it.
Which you can't have in a small economy like Tunisia with 11 million consumers, or Zambia with 20 million consumers, or for that matter. But as a block of countries, when you have 700, 800 million consumers, you have enough scale to actually have industrialization. If you try to industrialize alone, you end up manufacturing a small component in somebody else's industrial policy. So you become export oriented, locked at the bottom of the hierarchy, which is the case today. So that's point number one. A block of countries with a joint industrial policy that is pre-negotiated, meaning you pre-negotiate the distribution of the value chain so that you don't have a country locked at the bottom and a country at the top, therefore reproducing the same hierarchies that we have today. So that has to be pre-negotiated so that all countries benefit from this industrialization. You pre-negotiate the ownership structure, right? You want these to be joint ventures. You pre-negotiate the protection of biodiversity, the protection of labor rights, environmental rights, human rights, right? Because we don't want to reproduce the industrial system that we've struggled with in the past. You can even pre-designate certain areas as untouchable biodiversity areas, so you don't do extractivism in biodiversity rich areas. So you
Rights
set
to
the
nature? Is that rights to nature that you're referring to? Rights to nature, like this theory, this legal theory of giving
you
like
can,
legal entity?
yeah, sure, yeah. But this is our homework, is to do internally before we strike a bargain with anybody. Say these are the terms of development and real industrialization that we want collectively, and then within this block you have the advantage of having the economies of scale. You have the youngest labor force on the planet, which is what we have in the global south. You have the complementarity of resources and capabilities. You have all the critical minerals that are needed for the economies of the future to manufacture the renewables and all of that. So you have everything you need except one thing, which is the manufacturing technology that will allow you to leapfrog immediately into manufacturing and deploying the building blocks of development that you want. Because this idea of catching up is a myth. There is no catching up, right? And we don't have time to catch up when the life-saving technologies are actually available but are being withheld from you. So imagine, and this is what I call the $0 industrial policy or $0 climate action policy, because each country pays for its labor and raw materials in its national currency. Usually we use dollars to import the manufacturing technology. And once you do that, you're stuck in a debt trap because the lender will want you to produce something for exports, not something to produce for yourself or your building blocks of development. This is where your bargain is now looking for a partner that will bring in-kind contribution, transfer and sharing of technology, including the transfer of skills and resources and building the pipeline of educational, vocational training to actually sustain that industrial policy. So it's in-kind contribution as a joint venture partnership, right? Not as a neo-colonial extraction or as a debt trap. So the question is, which country is going to be willing to share technology? We know from recent history and old history that the global north has always refused to share technology, to transfer technology. It's always been a red line. So imagine for a second that this block of countries with political leadership and commitment to this vision goes to a country like China, which is a country that is willing to share technology actually, and says, here's the deal. Here's the bargain of the century. If you share your technology to manufacture and deploy the building blocks that we want, let's start with solar panels, for example. In this block of countries, on our terms, these are the terms of extractivism, labor rights, human rights, everything. Here's what we give you in return. In 10 to 15 years, you double your industrial footprint globally. In 10 to 15 years, you double your geopolitical weight globally. And you secure your access to these precious minerals that everybody's panicking about. In addition to that, as soon as we actually trigger the process of real development and industrialization, escaping the bottom of the value chain, the rest of the global south will join because it's once in a lifetime opportunity. And now, if you agree to this bargain, we give you access to the biggest market on the planet with rising purchasing power, because today we don't have the purchasing power. But as we truly industrialize, we're bigger than the US, Europe, and the rest of the OECD countries combined in terms of market size and purchasing power. And any country any economic bloc will want to have privileged access to that market. In short, I guarantee you China will accept the bargain. We can go into details later. But the
I
purpose.
I want to say, sorry,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
really, really cool. And I really wanted to have you talk about this. And in a lot of ways, it's already happening, right?
No, it's not happening. And here's why the next step is important. Because the purpose of this bargain is not to put China at the top of the hierarchy on Chinese terms, but rather to reposition Africa and the rest of the global south at the center of a multipolar world. So this is the first step of the bargain. It's not finished yet. So triggering this bargain immediately gives you the second bargaining chip, which then you can take and go to a country like Germany and say, look, we want to offer you the same bargain we just gave to China. If you share your technology to manufacture and deploy wind turbine technology on our terms here in the global south, right? We don't want debt. We want joint venture partnership, real partnership, sharing of technology. And we offer you the biggest market on the planet to do this. At that point, Germany cannot say no, because if they say no, we go to Japan. If Japan says no, we go back to China and let them double, triple their economic and geopolitical weight and access, privileged access to the market. Then you go to France or Spain and say, we want high-speed rail, right? Manufactured and deployed in the global south on our terms, the biggest market on the planet, right? As joint ventures. It's a win-win. You will make money, right? It's the biggest market on the planet. We're not asking for charity. We're asking for in-kind joint venture partnership. At that point, they can't say no, because you can go to Japan, they have high-speed rail technology. You can go back to China and let them quadruple their economic weight. At that point, they cannot say no. So you choose the building blocks of development that you want to put in place, and you offer those bargains to the US, to France, to Germany, to Spain, to all the major producers, because there's plenty of market to share, right? But it has to be on these transformative terms. So the idea here is not to place any country on the top of the hierarchy, but rather reposition the global south away from the bottom at the center of a new international economic order, a truly multipolar world of peace, justice, and sustainable prosperity. And the bonus that comes out of this process are two things. One is related to workers in the global north, and two is related to living within the planetary boundaries. And this is why the climate movement should support this. This is why the labor movement globally needs to be part of this process. I'll start with labor. If our workers in the South are now busy manufacturing the building blocks of development and prosperity, high value added manufacturing, then our workers are no longer available to take the assembly line manufacturing jobs that are being outsourced from the North, which means real development, real climate action in the South is enhancing labor rights and social protections and protecting the middle class in the global North. So workers unite, right? Workers of the world unite is not an empty slogan, right? So that is important. And then workers in the North will pay attention not to immigrants who are being blamed for stealing their jobs, not to workers in the global South who are supposedly racing to the bottom, stealing their jobs, but pay attention to who's actually displacing them from their jobs. It's AI, automation, robotics, and who's actually extracting value. So then you focus your attention on distribution, on shareholders on Wall Street or in London who are actually extracting from labor from the North and from the South, and then focus your attention on the question of distribution. And that's what's going to move us forward. So that's on workers. And then finally on the planetary boundaries and on the question of degrowth. Because when the global South...
because of course, like everything that you mentioned here is very growth oriented, or it sounds like it
Not
at least in
necessarily.
appearance, right?
That's why I wanted to add this. So as we design the global South development vision, which is not obsessed with consumerism, which is not obsessed with extractivism, which is not obsessed with planned obsolescence, but is obsessed with sufficiency, right? So we want to design a different world to live within a planetary boundaries. But as we start using the strategic minerals that we have in the South for producing renewables, for producing clean cooking infrastructure, clean transportation infrastructure. When I say clean transportation, public transportation, not everybody in the South with their own Tesla car and Tesla battery, right? Public transportation. So this is the design that we have, the vision that we have for the South. Then that means there'll be much, much smaller quantity of minerals available to fulfill the needs of the growth-obsessed European Green Deal, the growth-obsessed American IRA, the growth-obsessed Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, right? If you take just these three models, they're planning to extract critical minerals from the global South in order to decarbonize their growth model and leave nothing, literally nothing, to the global South to develop, right? So as we use our minerals for development in the South, you start to compel the other side, the countries that actually have the research and development capabilities to invest in material science research, have the financial capabilities to redesign their cities, and have now the responsibility to put in place a coherent degrowth vision for themselves, to actually put in place a circular economy in which you are no longer obsessed with growth, consumerism, planned obsolescence, energy waste, and all of the stuff that is deeply embedded in the European Green Deal. It's a growth-obsessed deal, right? It's not a circular economy deal. But these conversations today, nobody can have them seriously with European or American and to some extent Chinese leaders because they see growth as the only way, right? But when you develop your own global South development strategy, then the numbers change. Then the reality will compel innovation and thinking that will produce a coherent degrowth vision for the North. And it will be for the better because degrowth in the North doesn't mean lower quality of life. It actually means much higher quality of life for consumers in the North. It's just not with all the waste and plastics and planned obsolescence. So that is the vision. That's the idea of the bargain of the century, kind of summarized very quickly here.
Well, it is, I think the least I can say is inspiring and refreshing to hear a very positive project in the times that we live in, right? And I think it will inspire others, and it's already inspiring a lot of people, I'm sure.
Thank you.
I want to challenge your ideas, right? Because good ideas always deserve to be challenged, right? So, what is the current state of China's position in Africa, and the current relationship between Africa and China? Because you said that China is already happy, or at least willing to share technology, which is a very interesting point. I also want to note that however negative things we could say or people might say about China's presence in Africa, well, it never sent any army to terrorize people, right? Which is already something. And it's not something that can be said about other armies. So what is the current real deal between Africa and China? What can be improved, right? And are there signs that your plan or a certain version of your plan, of let's say this plan, because it's not just your plan, but let's say of the idea of this bargain, how is this already happening, and which countries could be involved into this?
So I'll start from the beginning with your question on China. Of course, China has been present on the African continent and other parts of the world as part of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, which is kind of the new Silk Road. And you have to understand why the BRI is important for China and for the Chinese economy. As you know, China doesn't build things or plan things, 3 years ahead, 5, 10 years ahead. It has a vision of at least 100 years ahead. And you have to admire, leaders who think in terms of, the short term being 50 years, the long term being more than 100 years, which is not something you see in the West, for example, or in the global South in general. Everybody's thinking about the next election. That's the longest term they can think of, unfortunately. So in that vision, the Chinese economy internally is developing and is building a middle class with higher income, right? Which means over time, China is no longer relying on low-tech assembly line manufacturing. It's no longer relying on low-cost labor. It's actually the era of low-cost labor in China is long gone, which means as a country that is specializing into higher tech industries, into even dark factories now, factories that only use robotics and therefore don't need any lights, right? That's why they call them dark factories and work 24/7. That era of industrialization is very different to where China was 30 or 40 years ago. So that structural transformation is also coupled with what the Chinese government refers to as the dual engine economy. I forget what the Chinese term is for this, but essentially the two engines, the old engine of the Chinese economy was export oriented. Now the second engine that's kicking in is domestic consumption. And because it's a large internal market with rising purchasing power. So it can rely on its internal market, not just on exports to the rest of the world. And as part of that, economic model, you still have to have access to resources, raw materials from the rest of the world, and you have to have access to markets where you export, right? So that you're not solely dependent on the US or Europe. And you have to have access to other countries, especially neighboring countries in Asia and Central Asia, where you can outsource some of the assembly line manufacturing that you no longer need, right? And that is part of the vision of building this massive infrastructure of roads and ports and highways and infrastructure that includes energy generation capabilities. Unfortunately, some of it is coal-fired power plants, but also renewables infrastructure in other countries. But this is all for the purpose of having access to materials, having access to markets where you actually deliver, and having access to logistical infrastructure that allows you to link up with others. Of course, there is a dimension of influence. It's not just purely about business. Of course, when you're going into a bunch of countries to build that infrastructure, which in the long term is your vision for the infrastructure that you want, you have to go in diplomatically. So you engage with the heads of states and ask what are the development needs. You build a hospital for free. You build schools for free. You build a gym for the youth, right? These are nice gifts that you see from the Chinese governments all over the world, right? And including in our own country, in Tunisia, we have these amazing facilities that were built, in a matter of weeks, sometimes, not even months. So there is some of that
sorry.
diplomacy.
This is interesting because this is very important for everyone, of course. But you have a direct experience of that. So Raouf, you were going to say? But what are some of those facilities?
I just say stadium, hospitals, and everything. And actually, yeah, I feel that China is given a better condition in negotiation and all. But what I feel also that all the negotiation is about to show how strong you are, about improving the
Sure.
term of negotiation. Because it's not about China, it's not about Germany, it's not about any country. It's about you and what you show. It's
Yeah.
about how strong you are and to show them that I have something to give back. Like I have a big market, as Fadhel was talking about.
Yeah.
So now it's not about any one of them because they're no more an imperialist if you are strong enough. If you can build
Yeah.
like a united between the African country. And that's also what we're trying to do in that for climate because we're grassroots movement. We're in the street, but also if we find a kind of progressive government, we're trying to talk to them and we're trying to push them to work with other countries and to build something together and to go to negotiate together. It's impossible for Tunisia to go and negotiate alone and to get a good condition or to get something. So it's
Yeah.
more about improving yourself and improving the term of condition. That's the feeling that we have also.
Yeah, absolutely. So the other thing to add about, what China is doing in the global South, you have to also think about the other side, which is Western Europe and the United States and what they've done in the last several decades. What the Western world has done in the global South is essentially lower the bar so much that the only thing China has to do is offer something that is slightly better and have access to everything that they want. So the bar is so low, right? So in terms of economic entrapment, in terms of interference in internal political systems, in terms of military presence, all of that stuff is the trademark of Western interference. And now all of a sudden you see a rising economic superpower that is coming in and saying, we would like to ask you what you need. We have this massive, you know, manufacturing and construction capability that we would like to share with you. And we have this vision for the global South of building global South unity, and that we're willing to share with you. We have these loans that we're willing to support strategic investments. And yes, some of those loans, not all, some very small minority of those loans end up in a troublesome situation, but also a lot of those are resolved with debt relief or sometimes cancellation without dragging countries into austerity measures and further economic entrapment. So you can say whatever you want to say about the China's presence in the global South, but when you have a serious comparison of the record of what China has done versus what the US and Western Europe have done, the conditionalities imposed even for aid, right? To qualify for aid, you have to have a small army of accountants and transparency officers and assessment and reporting, that you end up spending more time and energy, accounting for the aid. And the aid is, by the way, imported, than actually receiving transformative aid. So these are things to keep in mind. And then finally, I'll close by saying that any major economic bloc, whether it's the US, China, or Europe, has every right to have a vision for itself, and has every right to use its economic diplomacy, to use its incentives, to nudge every country in the world to where they want to see them within that vision. And what we're saying here is that we in the global South, in Africa in particular, we also have the right to have our vision. We have the right to use whatever little leverage we have, economic diplomacy and incentives, ideally as a collective bloc, because as individual countries, you don't have a lot of weight. But as a collective bloc, you can use your economic diplomacy to reposition yourself in a slightly more favorable position as equal sovereigns with the major economic powers. So that is kind of the starting point for how you engage with any major economic bloc. And some economic blocs, their behavior with the African continent is slightly better than others. But you don't expect any major dominant economic bloc to come fix the continent for you and to give you all the privilege that you want without getting anything from you. It's just, that's not how the world works. So I don't blame the Europeans or the Americans or the Chinese for trying to further their interest. They have every right to do that. But I blame ourselves for not being organized enough and developing a vision that is coherent enough to actually wiggle ourselves out of the unfavorable position that we're in and kind of push ourselves into more favorable position that allows us to negotiate as equals, as sovereigns.
All right, I have to react to that because although I get your point, Raouf, you wanted to say? Sorry. Okay. You have a point, Raouf? Okay, sorry. You mentioned the idea of blaming either Europe or the USA and saying, okay, maybe we should like Africa should blame itself for not being able to form a bloc. I can't really agree with that in the sense that there's you raised a very important point in long-term thinking, and the worst that is coming out of the general state of geopolitics right now is this general impression of short-term thinking and confrontation of personal interest versus common good, right? That's probably the most negative impression we have from our elites, from our authorities, right? And we need leaders who are able to think long term and challenge the idea that the good we do or the benefit that we can take is always at the cost of the other, right? There are plenty of examples, of historical examples of the opposite happening, especially in the best periods of history, right? Like a good case of debt cancellation, the classical case of debt cancellation that worked really well is after World War II in Europe, where Germany was destroyed, and a lot of countries had a lot of reasons to keep destroying it until nothing was left. But instead, they canceled its debt and gave the country a good deal because Europe understood that they were neighbors. So it was in the best common interest to actually erase the debt and give like trading deals that allowed all the economies to share a little bit of the burden and share a little bit of technology so that they could rise together. And Europe rose together during the 50s and 60s, and it gave, good years at the time. Bad years for the rest of the world, certainly. But we need to understand in Europe, I think, that there is a beautiful future to be had if we are able to let go of some of the advantage of being in a position of advantage, so that like allowing the global south to have its own growth and or at least, if it's not the right word, but its own rising moment is actually better for everyone, right? But of course it will take a lot of transformation. And during your talk, I was thinking a lot about intellectual property, right? Because it sounds like this plan, especially like sharing technology and planning different like sectorial organization and nature protection and sharing knowledge between groups. All of that for all of that, we need some very deep transformation of how we think about intellectual property and who owns what.
Absolutely.
Because right now it's completely extractive and it doesn't work, and it's only benefiting investors and bondholders and shareholders, and that needs to change at a very, very fundamental level.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and on that, it's been 2 hours, and it flew by, absolutely flew by. Thank you so much. It's been incredible.
Thank you.
I think I want to ask you one final point, Raouf, maybe one last question or comment.
Well, for me, what I want to say that we understand all the colonizing history, and we understand all the problem with this monetary system, and we understand very well how it is a debt trap, and how we are put inside the circle. But at the same time, in Debt for Climate Africa, we're trying to work on ourselves also. We can't put blame only on the other side. We have a lot of work to do at the same time. We understand that the global north are even put in our government and all, but there is nothing make us not united, because now even when you see in Africa all the visas between each other, how we can travel, how we can meet each other and all, we don't have enough relation, we don't have embassies in our countries and all. We have a lot of work to do. We can just put blame. We have a fight we need to do in our country, because also we need to think what's after canceling the debt, if we ever cancel the debt, because we've seen a lot of countries, they cancel the debt, or they only cancel their debt to give them a new debt, because new loan, because the system, they work on that. They need new country, they need new indebtors, they need new country to take loans. So they will cancel some debt for their own benefits also. So we need to understand, if we want to cancel the debt, how to build ourselves, how to be together. We're working on that. We have a lot of work to do in Africa. We have a lot of fight to have. Yeah, I hope to see Father in Spain, in Seville. I will try to be there, and yeah, we can try to have a good discussion there if you find time. And yeah, thank you so much for the whole time we had together, for all the information. We're learning a lot, and yeah, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for all the good work that you're doing on the ground and everywhere, and COP and FFD and other spaces, because that's what it takes, is really for this push from below to happen from the grassroots to support the negotiation work that we talked about today. It takes informing, organizing, mobilizing from the grassroots, and I think Debt for Climate and other organizations are doing the heavy lifting when it comes to pushing for the kind of transformation we want to see.
All right. Well, on these great words, thank you, both of you, a lot. And yeah, let's call it. Let's see you in Seville. I'll be there. So I'll try to catch up with you and see and get some updates. And right.
Sounds good. See you soon.
See you soon. Bye bye, Raouf. Bye bye, Fadhel. You have been listening to a Debt for Climate podcast. Check us out on debtforclimate.org and follow us on social media.